and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. Now, Robbie is out today. We love our Robbie, but he has the constitution of a Victorian child. So I am thrilled to be joined today by Liz Wolfe remotely. Welcome back, Liz. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. I'm joining from Texas.
Well, thank you for giving us a call in from Texas. I know it's difficult to do this remotely, but I'm so glad to be here with you today. We've got a lot of news to get to. So first up, President Biden and Speaker McCarthy are set to resume debt ceiling negotiations tomorrow. The two leaders stepped away from the table after their first meeting in months failed to produce results last week. Biden is facing internal pressure from Hill Democrats to invoke the 14th Amendment to raise the ceiling and avoid sending the country into default. Senator Elizabeth Warren told the Hill, quote, "The 14th Amendment is not anyone's first choice. The first choice is that the Republicans raise the debt ceiling because the United States government never, ever, ever, ever defaults on its legal obligations. But if Kevin McCarthy is going to push the United States over a cliff, then it becomes the president's responsibility to find an alternative path." Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, however, poured cold water on the proposal when asked about it this weekend. Let's watch.
The 14th Amendment, the idea there that was discussed is that possibly that amendment would justify just issuing debt sufficient to pay all the government's bills and ignore the debt ceiling. And what President Biden said in his remarks is it's really not. There would clearly be litigation around that. It's not a short-run solution. And what I would say, it's legally questionable whether or not that's a viable strategy.
Joining us now to weigh in is the Hill's Mychael Schnell. Michael, welcome back to Rising.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so first off, for those who are confused about the 14th Amendment option and how credible it is, especially given this kind of dissonance between what Joe Biden has said and what Janet Yellen is saying, what's the deal there?
Yeah, so Bree, the key word there is if this will work, right? Whether or not the 14th Amendment is actually a viable option. And that's currently up for debate. It depends on who you ask. Some legal scholars are saying this could be a way that President Biden can circumvent Congress and raise the debt limit, or rather continue paying the U.S.'s debts without Congress increasing the debt limit. Others are saying that this cannot work, that the legal analysis is just not there. Now, President Biden has said that the 14th Amendment would not be a fix for the short term because it would almost certainly be tied up in the legal process and tied up in the courts with a lot of challenges, and we'd have to wait and see if the 14th Amendment is even a viable option. But nonetheless, Senate Democrats want President Biden to keep this on the table because A, they're nervous that negotiations are not going anywhere and that a default is actually a possibility. And B, they don't want to swallow these steep spending cuts that Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans are pushing for. So we saw something like what Elizabeth Warren said, what you mentioned in the introduction. Some Senate Democrats believe that Biden using the 14th Amendment could potentially be better than having to go through with those spending cuts.
Michael, are Republicans wrong to be worried about this type of runaway spending?
I mean, look, government spending, federal spending, deficit spending has been a concern in Washington for years. Lawmakers have always said that they want to be able to balance the budget, and that's what Republicans are saying now. Of course, listen, there's credence in their concerns about government spending, but what Democrats are coming back and saying is that this is not about new spending, right? This is about bills that we have to pay for spending that was previously appropriated, including money that was appropriated under former President Trump and during the Biden administration. So Democrats are saying that we can have a conversation about federal spending later on when we're going through the appropriations process, when we're building a budget for fiscal year 2024. But right now, all we're trying to do is pay the bills that we have already appropriated money for. Republicans, however, they see the debt ceiling as a negotiating chip, as a thing that they can bargain on because it is a must-pass issue. So that's sort of where we're seeing this back and forth about deficit spending and about the debt limit.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen, obviously, under Republican administrations, easy votes to lift the debt ceiling over and over and over again. Reagan famously raised it umpteen times when he was president. And despite the fact that Trump's own policies, including the Trump-era tax cuts, caused the national debt to go up significantly, even though those tax cuts, 83% of every dollar entered to the benefit of the richest people in America. Now we're having a conversation about whether or not the debt limit is going to be used to justify a number of cuts to the social safety net, et cetera. Can you try to detail the kinds of asks Republicans are making, where they want those cuts to come from?
Yeah, so you mean where Republicans have said they want that? Republicans have said that they want to bring federal spending back to pre-pandemic levels. Republicans have been saying that they want caps on budgetary spending for the next 10 years so they can rein in spending and try to balance the budget. And Republicans have said that they want to claw back unspent COVID-19 funding, so funds that were given to states during the pandemic that were not used since the pandemic has now been declared over. The COVID-19 national emergency has ended. Republicans are saying that they want to claw back those unused funds. Now, those are just some of the proposals. Of course, House Republicans passed that sweeping piece of legislation last month that would raise the debt limit by $1.5 trillion or through March 2024, whichever comes first, and it would implement $4.8 trillion in savings, spending cuts, however you want to square it. So those are just some of the proposals that Republicans have put forth in these negotiations. There's actually some indication that President Biden is now considering some after his meeting at the White House with congressional leaders last week. He said he would take a look at clawing back unused COVID-19 funding. Actually, just yesterday, when he was on a bike ride in Delaware, he was pulled aside by reporters and asked some questions about potential work requirements for federal programs. He said that he sort of conveyed an open suggestion that could be on the table. So we are now seeing some negotiating in terms of these terms for a debt ceiling increase.
Isn't this just par for the course for Joe Biden? I mean, we saw this when he was attempting to pass student loan forgiveness, which made a whole bunch of flashy headlines and got a bunch of people very excited, understandably so, but then has been held up in the courts ever since. Is this also the type of thing that's legally questionable, where perhaps he will attempt this 14th Amendment strategy, but it seems like if Yellen, of all people, is saying, hey, this is a little bit legally suspect and questionable, is this likely to work? What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the 14th Amendment, I think that's a long shot, right? That's, negotiators have been hopeful that they could reach a deal by the June 1st deadline. That is when Janet Yellen said it is possible that the U.S. could run out of cash to pay its bills. So nobody is looking towards the 14th Amendment. As Elizabeth Warren said in what you read earlier, Bree, it's not anyone's first choice. So if it comes to the point where the 14th Amendment has to be invoked, there will be a number of legal scholars and experts weighing in to see the credibility of that and if that's actually possible. But I think that's just being kept on the table right now and in conversations as, a break the glass strategy, something that if it came to that point that President Biden would use it, but I think that we're pretty far away from that point right now. There are 17 days until June 1st, which is not too much time, especially when you're dealing with Congress, but things could change overnight. This week, there is a meeting between Biden and the 4 congressional leaders where we could see some movement. So I don't think we're at the point yet of talking about the practicability of actually using the 14th Amendment and seeing it be invoked by President Biden. Of course, it's on the table and it's being floated in conversations, but there is still time for both sides to negotiate a deal.
And Democrats have said that there's this concern about establishing a precedent here, that if they do start basically opening back up the budget and making these cuts to especially social programs that are very popular for many Americans, that what's to stop it from happening the next time this crisis rolls around in a year. Why now are Democrats seemingly open to establishing that precedent as opposed to in other cycles?
I think that this just sort of speaks to the stalemate that we've been at. Remember, the U.S. first hit the debt limit back in January. That's when the Treasury Department invoked what are called extraordinary measures, measures that could be used to keep the U.S. funded and continue paying its bills. Those extraordinary measures are expected to now run out in June. That's why we're now having these increased pressure conversations about the debt limit. But remember, this conversation has been going on since January. And for, better or worse, and for the most part, it's remained the same. Republicans have been pushing for spending cuts. Democrats wanted a clean debt ceiling increase. We saw that continued rhetoric from January until now. So I think one reason why people may be floating more of these last-ditch, go-at-it-alone efforts is because the clock is A, running out, and B, it's because after a number of months, we have still not seen much progress.
Michael Schnell, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.